Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar from Place to Be. My name is Richard Ketley, and I'm a psychotherapist and a supervisor and a trainer. And I work as a staff trainer here in Scotland for Place to Be. I'm based in Edinburgh, and I'm working on the Place to Think groups at the moment, working with lots of different staff from a whole range of schools across Scotland. The focus of this afternoon's webinar is supportive conversations and listening with empathy. So the aims of this afternoon's webinar are we're going to explore how to hold supportive conversations through the lens of empathy, taking an empathic approach. Paying attention, I suppose, to the relationship between us and how we hold ourselves in that relationship. We'll consider with some examples how we demonstrate empathy, what that looks like in our ordinary day-to-day life with friends and colleagues about difficult issues such as mental ill health, loss and grief, anxiety, anger. And we'll have a look at barriers to empathy and how to support yourself while supporting others. Here's a kind of overview of the slides, some of which will be a repetition of the aims. We'll look at some definitions of empathy, as well as of supportive conversations. We'll look at some benefits of empathy and how we communicate it. What some of the barriers might be to empathy. We'll also recognise the impact on ourselves of empathy and how it might impact us, so risks to self and how to guard against any negative risk, any negative stuff. We'll touch on some active listening skills briefly at the end and how to follow up your supportive conversations. There will be a couple of activities. And so if possible, please have a pen and paper to hand so you can jot down some notes. I might also ask you to consider using the chat function if you want to share your experience. And while I can't invite you to enter into a discussion with me, that would be a way of communicating with me, and hopefully I'll be able to bounce off some of your ideas if you choose to do that. So first of all, here are a couple of definitions of empathy that I took from a source that if you get the slides or are able to follow up, please do. So the title, empathize, truly listen to what is being said. It might sound obvious, but so often we miss what is being said, either because we're distracted or because we get bound up in our own thoughts and feelings, and it's hard to pay attention to what the person is actually saying and meaning to communicate to us. So I'm just going to read something that Jessica Spear wrote. She's an author and speaker focused on helping kids and families thrive. She defined empathy in this way: empathy in difficult moments can open the door to what is going on underneath outbursts. Usually, sadness or fear is hidden beneath anger. When we empathize and listen deeply, we have a chance to truly connect with our kids. So this brings to mind that kids don't necessarily communicate with words in the same way that we do, making their meaning clearly heard. Sometimes we need to pay attention to the behavior and consider what is the communication behind the behavior. Maybe not to get too caught up in sometimes the distress, perhaps, or the lack of distress, to try and tune in. Maybe attunement is a nice word to use here. What is the music beneath the words that we're hearing? On the right-hand side of the screen, there's quite a nice distinction between empathy and sympathy. So Empathy, I feel your pain, is often seen as a way of connecting. You may have come across the speaker Brené Brown, who's done a very famous TED talk on empathy. And she promotes the connecting qualities of empathy. On the other hand, sympathy can be a means by which we disconnect with others. And in this cartoon, it's represented by the little figure turning away and saying, "I'm sorry that you're in pain." One more definition of empathy, and this time it's from a consultant child and adolescent psychiatrist, Dr. Haley van Zwanenburg. And so this might help you connect with what we mean by empathy and truly listening to what is being said. How an adult reacts the first time a young person discloses important information about how they're feeling can affect whether or not the young person goes on to disclose information in the future. If an adult gets cross or invalidates their feelings, a young person is likely to bottle up what they're feeling rather than speaking out in the future. If a young person tells you that they're feeling really rubbish, act in a calm manner. Listen to what they're saying and give them as much opportunity to talk as they feel comfortable with. This will help them to feel safe, and at that moment in time, that is what they need. A theme that I'll refer back to time and again this afternoon is the idea of intention and impact. So when we're engaged in supportive conversations, it can be really important to just keep a check on your intention in saying what you do or being the way you are in that moment, and also checking out the impact on the young person of how you are. So really paying attention to those relational qualities. What are supportive conversations? Here are some benefits. You're available in a way that a counsellor isn't, or a professional helper. So as somebody that children come into contact with in the course of their daily business, you're available. You're not depending on setting something up, making appointments and so on, unless you choose to. They could take place in a variety of settings. It might be when you bump into them in the corridor, or if they come and find you in your room. If it's during lockdown, then you might have been making phone contact or online contact. And those are also places that you might offer a supportive conversation. But it's important to recognize that whenever we listen with empathy, this can provide meaningful emotional and psychological support. And I feel we shouldn't underestimate the potential power of that. There are some risks, of course, and you never know what you're going to come across in a supportive conversation. You never know what the young person is going to say. It could be really challenging. You could feel well out of your comfort zone. So it's important to say up front that you could get out of your depth or feel overwhelmed. So try not to be surprised if that occurs, and be prepared, or as much as you can in advance, in how you might mitigate against that. Another risk is that the person you're talking to might have unrealistic expectations of what might happen as a result of the supportive conversation. And so one obvious example I thought of was, sort of dual roles in school. So for example, if you're listening to a young person and have pastoral concerns for their well-being, you might also, on one level, have a duty to uphold school rules, but on the other hand, it might be important for you to really be there for the young person and maybe help them understand the distinction, that the mode in which you're listening, maybe say, well, there is that, but I'm going to put that to one side for just now and just listen to you. Equally, it's useful to acknowledge safeguarding and the limits of confidentiality. This might be quite straightforward if you're face to face, if you're in a room somewhere, you kind of know if you're likely to be overheard. But if it's an online conversation, you might want to check, where the young person is, if there are others around them, if they can wear headphones and so on, so you're not overheard. So those are some of the ways we might assess our intention and possible impact. So just a word about helping relationships. I'd suggest we try and be mindful of boundaries and communicate them as necessary. So, I imagine these will take place within a professional context, and it's important to remember your professional role, I suppose, in talking to the whether it's a young person, child, or their parent, or a colleague, perhaps. Time boundaries, what do I mean by that? Be aware of how much time you've got. And it might be helpful to say, look, I've got, 2 minutes now, but if you come back at lunch, I've got 10 minutes then. Or you might even say, look, I'm really sorry, I don't have time now, but, maybe I can see you at the beginning of break or the end of the interval, something like that. Out of context might be if you bump into them outside the school context. So for example, if you live in the same community, you might bump into them at the shops or at the shopping mall or somewhere at the park. And it would be important if you met outside of school, bumped into one another and the person started confiding in you or expecting a supportive conversation. Obviously you've got a choice in that situation, whether you want to go there or keep it within the context that you know them. There are boundaries of confidentiality, mostly around safeguarding. You would probably have to share safeguarding concerns. And the setting, what do I mean by boundaries around the setting? Just consider the environment you're in. Ethical principles are borrowed from counselling, which I'm aware is more than a supportive conversation in that it has a structure. It's often a weekly thing, and there might be a contract as such. The counsellor is bound by an ethical framework. But I thought it'd be really helpful to share these ethical principles as a guide for you. So the first one, how can I be trustworthy in this situation? Am I being trustworthy? How can I respect this person's right to make their own choices, even if I don't agree with them? Acknowledging that the person is within their rights to make their own choices. How might I do good in this situation and not do harm? Am I being fair? Am I treating this person as I would treat another person? Is there some consistency there? And if not, why not? Conceivably, there are situations where that might happen. And then something about yourself, looking after yourself. And I think this is often an overlooked area of supportive conversations and listening with empathy. Of course, we're looking out for the impact on the other person of how we listen to them. But it's really important to monitor the impact on us of listening to the other person. It can be distressing, it can be difficult, it can be triggering, it can be it can leave us with stuff that affects the rest of our day. So it's important to consider, what can I do on my own to support myself when listening to others talk of challenging and difficult situations? I'm thinking of usual stuff like, I don't know, taking a walk, listening to music, having a bath, eating some nice food, playing with the dog, all those kinds of things. The kinds of things that you you do to take care of yourself, helping the helper, because if you're not in a good place, then you're unlikely to be able to support the other person in the way that you'd certainly like to. Okay, so a quotation here from Carl Rogers, who was a kind of leading figure in developing the ideas around counselling and psychotherapy. So what do we mean by listening in this context? So Carl Rogers said, we think we listen, but very rarely do we listen with real understanding, true empathy. Yet listening of this very special kind is one of the most potent forces for change that I know. And in fact, Carl Rogers went on from basing counselling and psychotherapy relationships around that to considering what are the implications of truly listening to ourselves and listening to other people, being in relationship. What are the implications for education, for business scenarios, for conflict and resolution? So I'm going to read you a poem now, which is often used in counselling training sessions. And I'm going to invite you to notice what thoughts and feelings bubble up for you as you hear it. If you've got your pen and paper handy, this would be a good time to jot down some notes. Otherwise, just notice those thoughts and feelings come and go, and you might jot down some at the end. So it's just a poem called Listen, and it's anonymous. When I ask you to listen to me and you start giving me advice, you've not done what I asked. When I ask you to listen to me and you begin to tell me why I shouldn't feel that way, you're trampling on my feelings. When I ask you to listen to me and you feel you have to do something to solve my problem, you have failed me, strange as that may seem. All I ask is that you listen. Not talk, nor do. Just hear me. And I can do for myself. I'm not helpless. Maybe discouraged and faltering, but not helpless. When you do something for me that I can and need to do for myself, you contribute to my fear and weakness. But when you accept as a simple fact that I do feel what I feel, no matter how irrational, then I quit trying to convince you and can get about the business of understanding what's behind this irrational feeling. When that's clear, the answers are obvious, and I don't need advice. So please listen and just hear me. And if you want to talk, wait a minute for your turn, and I'll listen to you. I'll give you just a moment to jot down your responses. So I'm not asking you to share these necessarily. This is just a personal reflective exercise. What thoughts and feelings bubbled up for you as you listened to that poem? So just to round off this bit about listening, for me, there are power dynamics in play when we listen. Do we listen in a way that we hear things in the context of our own life and not that of the speaker? To what extent do we or can we attune to the other person and try and understand things from their frame of reference? To what extent do we feel able to acknowledge someone's hurt or pain without feeling the need to fix or minimize it? What is it communicating to that person if we respond by telling them what we think or what we think they should do? What might it be like to acknowledge their reality, even when it differs significantly from our own, and to be with that rather than feeling we have to rush to do something? I wonder if you can remember a time when you told someone something and they just didn't get it, or they did get it and launched into action mode when that wasn't what you intended. What was that like for you? Lots of questions there, hopefully to stimulate some reflection for you. And these reflections will develop in the next activity, hopefully. So the first activity I'm wanting you to do, and this is one where you might use the chat function later on to share, please, after we've seen the two images that I refer to. It's based on the principle that listening starts with ourselves, noticing what's going on for us, what is being triggered for us. So we might put it aside perhaps and really listen to what might be going on for the other person. And so this activity, I'm just going to share with you a couple of slides, and all I want you to do is notice your response to each of them. So for example, what are you drawn to in each of the pictures? And what meaning or story might you make of each of them? Because as human beings, we tend to make stories, we fill in the gaps. So when we see something or hear something, we tend to fill in the gaps and make meaning from it. I'd like you to notice your emotional response to the image, and try and think what words you would use to communicate your experience of looking at this image to the other person. Okay, so I'll say those things again while you look at each slide, so you can focus on what is your response. Here's the first picture. So take a moment to just absorb the image you see in front of you. And first of all, just notice what you're drawn to. Which part or parts of the image are you drawn to? And I wonder if you're making meaning or making a story about this picture. What do you think it's about? What do you think is going on here? Now try and notice your emotional response to the image. How do you feel about it? And what words would you use to communicate that experience to someone else? Just give you a few moments more on this image, and then we'll move to the second and final one. So same questions again. Take a moment to take in the picture, absorb it. First of all, notice what you're drawn to. Are you making meaning from it? What do you think's going on in the picture? What story might there be? Try and notice what your emotional response is, how the picture makes you feel, or what you feel as you look at it. And what words would you use to communicate your experience of this picture to someone else? Just give you a few moments more to jot down anything. Okay, so there are the questions again, and the bit at the bottom says, please feel free to use the chat function if you'd like to share your responses. This would enable us to see a variety of responses, and I'll try and respond to your responses. I did notice at some point there's somebody put up their hand, so I wonder, I'm not sure if you can speak and I can hear you, or if you'd like to say what you'd like to say in the chat function, and we can take it from there. And I wonder, Natalie's our program coordinator, is helping me with this recording. If you're able to help me with the chat, Natalie, that'd be great.
Hi, Richard.
Hiya.
We haven't received any questions so far via the chat or any comments.
But okay.
Oh, here we do. So there's a note here from someone about image 2.
Yep.
Saying that the person looks like she can't get home, maybe metaphorically. She's lonely and isolated.
Thank you.
I think this might be easier if you open up the chat box using the toolbar at the top of your screen, because the messages are coming through quite quick and it might be easier for you to read it than me to quickly read.
So if I click on participants, or
there should be a chat sign.
No, can't see that, I'm afraid. Maybe because I moved the other chat function. Are you able to read some of them out for me, Natalie?
Yes, yeah.
Thanks.
Definitely. There's another person who said, drawn to the feet in the first image, loneliness. Another person that said, drawn to the red reflection in the first picture. And we've got sad, helpless, and depressed. This one's quite... this person said they found the first picture slightly disturbing, and the second made them feel empathy for her. You've got both images reveal to me a sense of isolation and children being invisible or living as an onlooker. She doesn't look like she or he can help themselves.
Right.
This one's about image 1. 2 shadows, but only one person standing down there.
I think that's plenty. Thank you, and thank you very much for those people who contributed those. And I'm sorry I haven't had time or been able to hear others. I think there's quite a lot of consistency there in the themes, isn't there, of isolation and something slightly disturbing. And I wonder if there's something about how we framed the activity within the context of this session. I hope you notice some variety within those comments and some meaning making which might relate to your own kind of experience. Certainly whenever I've used these images in other training scenarios, some people, for example, have, of course, seen isolation and so on, like you have. Some have taken a more playful attitude to the first one. So if I go back to the first slide, hopefully. For some people, it evokes kind of autumn and jumping and splashing in puddles, for example, a bit more of a playful thing. Other people sort of focus on what the things might be in the sort of puddle or water there, whether they're sort of leaves or fish or some kind of objects. I'm interested in the idea of a second person, so thank you for whoever saw that in it. The second one, it might interest you to know that the image is actually of the neighbour of the artist. The neighbour of the artist was a young girl who had a disability, which meant she couldn't walk, and the artist was really struck by how she wasn't held back by this, and she made her way across the fields and so on in this sort of remote part of America. So I think one of the sort of things I want to draw from this exercise is that there's potentially multiple meanings from it. It's difficult to make assumptions with any accuracy, simply when we rely on ourselves to fill in the dots. So I've got a couple of quotations here from a psychotherapist and trainer I admire very much, Linda Finley. And she said these two things. When we're listening, try to put aside pre-existing ideas and assumptions and be ready to be filled with curiosity and wonder. I often come back to those two words myself. Try and be filled with curiosity and wonder as I listen. It's natural to sort of make meaning in terms of our own perceptions of things, but what we're trying to do is really listen to tune into what the other person means. And it reminds me of the poem I read to you, Listen. As listeners, we really need to get used to beginning in silence. So giving the space to the other person. I just picked an image there because I often use this in training as well. People see different things in this image. I wonder what you see in it. Some people see like an animal, like a dog or a bear with two eyes and its nose at the top. Some people see a person standing in the middle. Some people see it as a kind of landscape. So it's kind of one of those odd figure and ground kind of images, I suppose, that people see different things in. So just to pick apart a bit more, what are the implications for us of listening to others? This idea that we try and make space for them and notice what's going on in us so that we might put those thoughts and feelings aside. So we're trying to focus on understanding the other person's perspective, which might well be different to us, especially if they're significantly younger or from a different kind of cultural background from us. They're likely to have had different life experiences from us. Okay, so second point, try to notice your own thoughts and feelings about the experience they're talking about, but try not to confuse your response with their response. So try not to assume that simply because you're responding to a situation in a certain way, that will be their response. So for example, when I started out as a counsellor, I very quickly learned that if somebody, well, bit of context, I was particularly working when I was training in a counselling service for people who'd experienced childhood abuse. And sometimes people would report that a family member had died. And at first my natural response was say, oh, I'm really sorry to hear that. But of course, it wasn't necessarily the case that they were sorry, that the person that could have died could be the person who had abused them, for example. So quite a challenging example, that one, and quite an extreme one, but hopefully it serves to illustrate the point. And we've already considered the difference between empathy and sympathy. Another word here, over-identification. So if you've experienced something similar to what the person is describing, it can be possible that we it really strongly resonates with us, and it becomes very difficult for us to separate our experience from their experience. Be open to what the person is saying, and find what they find important. So this idea of, you may have come across the term horizontalization. So in counselling, we talk about how it's very hard for us to identify what's important to the other person, and to remain open to the idea that they may attach significance to any of what they've said. And sometimes what is most significant to them, sometimes it's the most challenging bit or the most tricky bit. So sometimes people sort of slip it in and gloss over it. But sort of as a listener, you get used to sort of noticing everything that somebody says and being open to any of what they say. So find out what's important to them. And then I suppose just the sort of values and qualities we might expect from a listening relationship, so compassion and respect. Just a little thing at the end there, you know, sort of, I'm trying to think of the person that we're listening to. When we feel valued by others, so when we feel valued by the person who's listening to us, then we can learn to value ourselves. Right, so there's kind of a second activity here. So you might want to have your pen and paper here. I don't think I'll invite you to share them in the chat function this time. Again, it might be quite a personal response you have to this one. So there's certain headline kind of issues there. And I want to start off by saying to this slide, we bring our own experiences to our reading of situations. So it's important to know what we bring. And this slide encourages you to reflect on your lived experience of these issues, if any. Okay. So, oh, sorry, jumping ahead. Just an open question. What is your experience of these challenging topics? I've listed mental ill health, loss, anxiety, anger, grief. I could go on, okay? But just from those, is there one or two that you've really experienced? Or a family member, or a friend, or a colleague, somebody important to you? Try and connect with your experience of that challenging issue, okay? And I'm suggesting we can inwardly draw on our own lived experience so that we might respond outwardly with empathy, okay? But like hopefully the previous exercise showed, we need to acknowledge that our experience will be unique, and it will depend on our own early life experiences, our culture, our beliefs, as well as our experiences of oppression and privilege. And I've listed some of those here. It might depend on how old you are, what gender you identify as, what your race is, what abilities or disabilities you have, your sexuality, your faith, your socioeconomic status. All of those things that in our society might privilege us or oppress us. Those will affect our experience of these issues. So I'm going to invite you to choose one of them and reflect on how your lived experience might show when listening to another person. Okay. So imagine that person is coming to you to talk about an issue that resonates with you. Okay. And consider things like your facial expressions, your gestures, your stillness, your verbal responses. What impact might these have on the person you're listening to? What is going on within you, inside you, and what is going on between you? So relationally, what is going on between you? So just to elaborate a little bit, what might it be like for the other person if you respond with shock and horror to what they're telling you? Might be perfectly understandable if they're describing an abusive situation or something really horrible, but what might it be like for them and their capacity to carry on talking if they see that shock and horror really apparent in you and really strongly? On the other hand, what might it be like if you remain silent and expressionless? What does that communicate to them? So I suppose the challenge is, how do we communicate that we're listening, that we're trying to understand what it's like for you, that we're taking you seriously and not dismissing what you have to say? I'll give you a few moments just to reflect on that and what it might be like for you to have somebody speak to you about an issue that resonates deeply with you and some of your lived experience. So returning to this idea of listening and listening with our whole selves, which hopefully I've been encouraging you to do with the exercises we've been looking at so far in the webinar. And I've got here the Chinese symbol for listen. Understand this is the symbol for the Chinese word ting. So I'll be interested if Chinese colleagues can confirm that or how that sits with them. But what is true of Chinese symbols is that each part of the Chinese symbol is made up of brush strokes and characters that have individual meanings. So the whole symbol that means ting, to listen, when it's written down, is composed of a bit, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, that's the symbol for ear, and here's the symbol for self, and for eyes, and for heart. And perhaps one of the most important things that we haven't really mentioned yet is this idea of undivided attention. And I suggest, sort of, when listening is concerned, sort of 2 minutes of undivided attention is way better than 20 minutes of divided attention. So when we're approaching supportive conversations and looking to work with empathy and relationally, try and find a time and a place and a feeling within yourself that you're able to attend with undivided attention and you're able to listen with all of you. On the other hand, we need to be aware of what some of the barriers to empathy might be. And these barriers might be environmental, physical, emotional, or cognitive. So some examples, let's work from some examples. What happens to your level of empathy when you're walking across the playground or down a corridor? How is it possible, or to what extent is it possible, to offer your undivided attention in that circumstance? It's an environmental example. What about if you're hungry or just need the loo? It's a physical barrier to empathy right there. Can you listen in that circumstance? Or do you need to find a way of saying, look, you know, let's find out, I really want to listen to you, but can we meet here in a minute or two? Or if you know you're going to meet somebody for a supportive conversation, just try and prepare yourself that it's a time and a place when you're going to be able to physically be present. Emotionally, if you've just finished a difficult class and you're feeling drained, either a young person or a colleague or somebody wants to have a supportive conversation right there and then, is that, you know, are you going to be able to give of yourself in that sense? And again, then it's an ethical dilemma in a way, isn't it? And you'll weigh up, you know, sort of, do I need to put things in place so I can listen with undivided attention? Or is it, am I okay enough to proceed to the potential risks of not being able to provide undivided attention outweigh the benefits of being accessible right here, right now? What if somebody just comes at a really difficult moment? You're really caught up in something. You're in the middle of a really difficult email or planning a lesson or something, and somebody knocks on the door and they want to have that conversation with you there and then. Is it okay to just say, you're really welcome to come in, but just sit quietly for a moment just while I finish off my chain of thought? Or listen, I'm on my own just now and it looks like I'm available, but actually I really need to finish this. I also really want to listen to you, but if you come back at the interval or whenever during the day, you know, then I'll be able to really pay attention to you. So how can you create the conditions of where you can offer empathy? And just noticing as well, you know, sort of, I'm coming back to that poem, Listen, we talked about earlier. What we're proposing here isn't problem solving. It's listening with empathy. Okay, so you're not expected to go into fixer mode, although that is sometimes an outcome of supportive conversations. But the first thing is to listen, and any fixing would be in response to somebody inviting that, in my opinion. So what might be difficult or challenging for you? And I'm going to finish in 2 or 3 minutes, so to make space for some questions and answers. Risks to self, these will be different for each person. So I'd encourage each of you to take some time to consider your own kind of risk assessment, if you like, in advance of offering supportive conversations. Might you over-identify? Might it be difficult for you to figure out which feelings are yours and which are theirs? Might you suffer from vicarious trauma? So listening to traumatized people talk about their trauma can be traumatizing for the listener. Okay, how can we look after ourselves? Have some downtime afterwards, you know, maybe talk to somebody else, maybe not identifying that person unless you need to, but talking about what's been going on for you, remembering to eat and sleep well. Is there a risk of being re-traumatized yourself? Is there a risk of being triggered? And again, this is where it's possibly good to know what some of your own issues are, or what your own lived experiences of mental health or loss or anger, some of those issues we talked about earlier. And could you suffer from burnout? This is a real problem amongst counsellors and psychotherapists. And I'd suggest respectfully as well for teachers as well, if we're constantly giving of ourselves, what is the potential for burnout? So just a practical thing, how can you ensure you're present in this situation? Just a few tips here. Set the scene, make sure the time and place allow you to pay close attention. Take a moment to ground yourself. Yeah, take a few deep breaths, feel the ground beneath your feet, and steady yourself physically and emotionally. Remember, a few slow, deep breaths will help slow your heart rate. Stay in the here and now. Yeah, notice your environment. Orient yourself in the present moment. Notice what's going on for you. Try to notice what's going on for the other person. And try to notice what's going on between you. If it's helpful, come back to that idea of what your intention is and what your impact is. In other training and in other place to be training, for example, if you do the Mental Health Champions Foundation program, you'll hear about stuff like active listening skills. You may have done it in other CPD as well. And if you want to learn how to respond verbally, here are some examples right here. It might be minimal prompts. It might be reflecting back keywords and phrases, asking open questions, or summarizing to show that you've heard the main points. And finally, follow up. And if possible, try to end the conversation in a way that you and the other person might feel grounded. So it might be, if it's been a really difficult conversation, you just check in with the person, you know, sort of where they're off to next, or if they've got time to just take a moment to recover themselves, that kind of thing. You might explore practical next steps if you feel there's something somebody needs to do, either a person they need to connect with, a pathway forward, or a place they need to go. Write up and share as necessary, appropriate. That's where safeguarding might come in. Consider yourself and your self-care. Okay, so after you've listened to somebody, take a moment to pause or move before your next task and activity. At a later date, you may check in with the other person as well, if possible and or appropriate. Okay. So we've come to the end of my bit of the webinar. There's some contact information for Place to Be. And if you have any questions for a bit of a discussion, please enter them in the chat function. And again, I'll invite Natalie to help me respond to those.
Hello again. Just responding to some messages.
Thanks, Natalie.
So for anyone asking about the slides for the PowerPoint, I'm afraid we don't share PowerPoint slides, but we will make available a recorded version of this webinar on our website. You just need to edit the video, top and tail it off, and then put it on our website, and you'll be able to access it. Oh, it looks like there's a question here, Richard.
Yeah.
If a child asks you not to share with the parents what they've shared with you because you don't want to upset them, how would you deal?
That's a really good question. I guess it would depend on your safeguarding policy within your school, and it would depend on lots of factors, I suppose. The age of the child, the nature of the concern. I would certainly say that it might be helpful to say, I can't promise that I won't share anything, or that I won't share anything that you tell me, because it may be a safeguarding issue. And I think a lot of children will understand that. It's a bit of a dilemma because it may mean they don't tell you what they were going to tell you. But I think in my experience, in a lot of cases, if they've got to the point where they've summoned up the courage to talk to you about it, again, depending on the age of the child, they probably realize that if it's serious, a safeguarding issue, it will be shared. However, there may be things that you listen to that you don't feel you need to share, and that it is okay for you to hold between you and the child. So I think, you know, the answer to that question is you can't promise that. Really, and until you know what it is they're going to say. and it's only fair to the child or young person to let them know that up front.
There's another question here. What are some verbal and non-verbal responses that show empathy rather than sympathy, or how to signal support whilst listening and as a response to being told something?
Yeah, good question. So there's a resource I can point you to by somebody called Egan, who there's an acronym that I'm not going to remember everything that it is, but it's SOLAR. So if you Google SOLAR and Egan, it will address this very issue. Some of the minimal prompts, I would say, some of it's as simple as nodding, yeah. Things that indicate that you're listening, you're attending, but you're not interrupting. So it's things to encourage the flow. You might consider your posture, sort of, are you sort of, are you on a level with the person? Sort of, you don't want to be towering over them. Is your body language open to be receptive to what they've got to say, or are you there with everything crossed and a big frown on your face? So I think, generally speaking, ask yourself, do I look open to receiving this information? Do I look open to listening whatever it is you have to say to me? And then if you'd like to follow up that particular resource, I think the acronym is SOLAR, and the person that came up with that was Egan.
Wonderful. Always sharing your further resources, Richard. There's a comment here from Catherine. They said that, I think that when I'm listening, I often think about what I'm going to say next, and that gets in the way of really attuning.
Yes, yeah, I really empathize with that. But truthfully, we can often get bound up in thinking, oh, what do I say? What do I do? And that can get in the way of listening. And I think the more you do it, the more you kind of trust yourself to respond in the moment. I think the danger of pre-preparing an answer is that you kind of miss what they're saying while you're composing your answer. So you may miss a whole load of stuff. So it's a little bit like sort of rubbing your tummy and patting yourself on the head, if you know what I mean. It's something you get better at, I think, as you go on. But I would encourage you to stay in the moment with what they're saying. And then maybe when they come to the end, sort of say, maybe just take a moment and maybe even just say, oh, that's a lot to take on board. Please just give me a moment while I, gather my thoughts and feelings together. And that might give yourself a moment then to figure out how you're going to respond in the moment. Or, yeah, maybe that's enough for me to say just now.
As another comment from someone, I realized I'm okay at listening at work, but not at home. It's a really useful reminder.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I think, home is a great place to practice listening, actually. And once you do, it might be revelatory for your relationships, who knows, hopefully in a good way. Yes, often we go into professional mode and listen very well professionally. It's something as a counsellor, as a therapist, I'm very aware of. When I go home, I've possibly got high expectations to live with, so I'm a therapist, but I'm also a person. So, recognize, that you're a person too as well. Yeah.
Another comment from, sorry if I mispronounce your name, Ewan. In my experience, teenagers can be reluctant to share things with us if they think we're going to share with their parents. If it isn't too serious or safeguarding related, I sometimes make an agreement with the young person on who to speak with and when.
Excellent idea. So I would call that kind of contracting. which maybe makes it sound very formal. But I think paying attention to the relationship in that way, and I'd call it sort of communicating about communicating. So I think, you know, being really clear, being transparent about stuff like that leads to psychological safety. So I think that's a really great observation and a really great contribution to this discussion. So thank you. Yeah.
Another question. What do you think of silence? Do you think that it helps in some cases?
Silence.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's a really interesting activity, but if you're somebody likely to become involved in supportive conversations, is maybe to just spend some time reflecting on your own relationship with silence. So what's it like for you when there's silence? And be open to the possibility that somebody else would have a different experience of silence. So I think as a listener, when I'm at the beginning of a listening relationship, I often check it out, you know, sort of, oh, you know, what's it like for you to, for us to be silent together, or for me to be silent and you just listen. So I'd sometimes check it out with somebody. And as you attune to somebody, you get a feel for what's their relationship with silence and how do they feel about it, whether they're intimidated by it and try to cover it up and hurry over it, or whether they really welcome it and it's an opportunity to reflect.
This person asking whether you have any tips for supporting children with just listening rather than trying to fix problems, how to respond when they are sharing their experiences.
I think I'd probably go back to that poem, Listen, and what advice would I give to somebody who just wants to listen? I suppose stay in the present moment. Don't rush to that fixer mode. And I guess I'm very aware that in schools, we are often trying to solve problems. We are often trying to write the next lesson plan or make sure a certain person gets from A to B safely, or do this, that, or the other. And just recognizing that in a supportive conversation, that's not necessarily what the person is after. What they're looking for is empathic understanding. They're wanting you to not sort of go, okay, what you need to do is this, that, and the other. It's, oh, yeah, I hear you. Yeah, it sounds like that's really tough for you. So trying to stay with the emotion, I suppose, rather than going to that rational place, perhaps.
I've realized we're over time, but there are
Yes.
quite a few interesting questions, Richard.
How can I answer them then?
Okay, lovely. There's a question that says, can you make recommendations for a situation where a teen or young adult who also has additional support needs to facilitate conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think try and be visual where you can, try and be creative where you can. So whether you're using mood cards or emoticons, sometimes things like social stories are helpful for young people like that to understand what a supportive conversation might be. So you might work through with them as a social story. This is what a kind of pastoral conversation might be. And that will often be visual. So there would be lots of resources, I think, potentially online to help you with that. Or take advantage of people in school, your educational psychologist or your additional support needs people. Yeah.
There's a message here from Constantina. In many cases, I think I approach a conversation through the lenses of my own experiences. Is there a way to become better on this?
Yeah, I think being aware of it is the first step. And I suppose approaching supportive conversations, if you're aware that you tend your own experience is very alive for you, try and ground yourself, like I said in one of those final slides. So maybe a few deep breaths, feel the ground beneath your feet, and try and open yourself to what you're hearing. It might be that you consider having another place to take your stuff to. So is there a trusted person you can talk to about your own stuff, that that comes up for you when you're listening to somebody else? All those things might help you be present for the person you're listening to.
Wonderful. On that note, that was the last question we received.
Brilliant.
We have received many thanks, Richard. I think that all goes to you for delivering this webinar today.
Well, thank you for attending. It's quite strange, I can't see you or hear you, but I've really enjoyed your questions and really wish you well with this in your schools. And yeah, thanks for attending and enjoy the rest of your day.